Bonjour.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of So French. In this show we give you everything about the twists and turns of French politics and an insight to all things French.
We select the best, most interesting and fascinating of French news stories, all brought to you from our studio near the Eiffel Tower, not far away, literally a stone's throw. My name is Stefan de Vries.
And my name is Sara
And this week we talk about the death of a statesman. Former French President Jacques Chirac passed away last week, prompting days of extreme rolling media coverage, overshadowing what could have been France's worst industrial disaster in decades.
And how a paralysed Frenchman got up from his wheelchair and walked. Stefan, a divine intervention? Or, well...
Maybe more.
We'll tell you all about the story behind this.
But first, we talk about black rain. Last week in Rouen, west of Paris, there was a huge fire in a chemical plant. 5,000 tons of chemicals ignited in an American factory. Rouen, a big city, about 200,000 people, just in Normandy. It was a big fire, huge explosions. And an enormous ash cloud, or what was it exactly?
And it burned for almost 24 hours.
Yeah.
So it was not just a small thing. It was, ongoing for a very long time. And yes, spreading. What was actually being spread? Because that is one of the questions here.
Absolutely, yeah. They published a list after a week of speculations about what was exactly in the factory, but it was not really clear what went up in smoke, which chemicals had burned. So it's a huge fire, and very quickly, schools were closed in the region of Rouen. They stayed closed for 1 or 2 or 3, even 3 days, some areas. And people started publishing photos on social media of black oil smoke coming down in their gardens or on their cars. And at the same time, that was, of course, breaking news, this big fire. But then Chirac died at that very moment. And then suddenly nobody spoke about Rouen anymore. But the story doesn't stop there. Actually, it's only started because, what happened after the fire, Sarah?
But the big thing has been that immediately after the fire, and only hours after the fire, authorities came out and said that there was no risk for the population. And just to mention also that this factory was really close to the apartment buildings. So it's sort of surrounded by big apartment blocks and things like that. So it's very central. It's not a fabric that was kept outside of the outside of the city. But officials immediately came out, said there are no risks. And actually, on the day of the morning, the same day as this fire, the schools were supposed to remain open. And some teachers arrived in school and some children as well. But, they quite immediately decided that it was not possible to continue because, they knew nothing about the risks either for the teachers or for the students, of course.
Yeah. So even when the fire was still going on, the government officials already said, "Don't worry, it's nothing harm."
Yes, and there were very, very few. I mean, what the population has been complaining about that is for a long time there was no real indication on how to deal with this. People have been testifying about, no instructions as to how should they leave, which direction should they go, when could they come back, what has to be, taken, what can be. I mean, could you touch it, or should you definitely stay away from it? I mean, there was no indication of how to deal with this kind of the downfall.
Yeah, and the préfet, which is the local representative of the government, so the most important authority in the region, he didn't even want to answer questions, right? He was very arrogant, and he said, "No, just move on. There's nothing to see here."
And the whole, as you mentioned, then the whole coverage about this disaster was overshadowed with the death of Jacques Chirac. So we saw for 4 days all of the country's media outlets being fully concentrated on the death of a former president. And it's only been, over this last week that, Rouen has been brought back up on the front pages, and the real tough questions have been starting to be asked. And, as a result of this, finally the list of the chemicals was officialized this week, and more and more tests are being made, etc. But we're now a week, as we're recording this, we're a week after the disaster.
Yeah. And the Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, he visited the site and he said again there is no harm for health, there are no health risks.
And he said this without knowing, which I find very interesting, because since they don't have the test results yet, how could he says that it's uncomfortable because it smells and it sticks and, you don't feel well, but it's not dangerous. But I am just very curious to know that how can you give such an assurance when no one has received the full test results?
And there are calls for an independent research, an independent expert panel that would investigate, but the préfet said once again, I don't want independent experts. So it's a really strange story. And of course, the locals and even now more people in France, they say we cannot trust the government with these results because, of course, the relations between the French and the government are very complicated. There's much less trust in government and other authorities than in other countries, or north of Europe or in Germany, for instance. But they also have a right to blame the government, right? There's a story.
But there is we can clearly say that the track record for French authorities when it comes to warning and giving instructions for the population in times of crisis is not that good. I mean, we don't have to go very far back. Only a couple of months we had the disaster at the big fire of the Notre Dame de Paris,
exactly,
where it was weeks. It took weeks before the authorities started to look into the fact that a lot of lead actually was released during the fire and then fell down on the neighborhoods close by. But then if you go a little bit further back in time, in the 1986, French authorities, and this is quite amazing, actually claimed, when in the middle of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, claimed that the cloud from Chernobyl disaster stopped at the French border.
Absolutely. And we have a little soundbite of the news of that night, of the week of the 26th of April in 1986. Let's have a listen.
Que cette poussière aspirée depuis l'Ukraine serait renvoyée vers l'Italie, la Yougoslavie et l'Autriche. En France, l'anticyclone des Açores s'est développé. La météo affirme qu'il restera jusqu'à vendredi prochain suffisamment puissant pour offrir une véritable barrière de protection. Il bloque en effet toutes les perturbations venant de l'Est.
So this is the official news saying, don't worry, the cloud will stop at the border. And there was actually, of course, France has a huge nuclear power. Almost all the electricity comes from nuclear power. They have the atomic bomb. So the nuclear sector is pretty powerful. Absolutely. But then just bluntly, the government and the news, they were lying to the people. So,
and this has become a joke here in France. Everybody talks about this, how, we all know that the clouds that stopped at the border. But at the same time, there are some much more serious consequences to this. And it is, as we said, the fact that people just don't trust authorities. So if we go back to Rouen, the problem is that maybe the authorities are right. Maybe there is no risk whatsoever. But, who will know? How can you be sure that if there was a risk, they would have told us? So, and this is something very, very serious in French society at the moment, and especially in these kind of situations, because you also have then, people maybe, you have, of course, personal consequences for people if they're they're scared for their health. And they decide to leave, to sell their house, or just leave everything. And extreme personal consequences. And maybe if there is no risk, maybe for nothing.
No, it's really a very complicated issue because people just don't trust authorities here in general, and of course that means if you don't trust authorities, you don't trust your neighbors. It has a huge impact on how this society is organized, and unfortunately, with the big fire in Rouen last week, we see it once again. So that's one issue. But then, of course, there are also very practical consequences. For instance, Normandy is very well known for agriculture. There are a lot of farmers in the region. Camembert, for instance, indeed.
And
cidre,
butter, milk,
butter, absolutely,
a lot
of
dairy products.
Yeah. So what happens with
well, I
those
mean,
farmers?
so this big cloud, of course, did not stop at the city border of Rouen. Of course, this cloud moved on to other municipalities, to other regions. It's actually 5 departments that are départements that are concerned now by this black rain that fell down from after the fire. 206 municipalities, and it's of concern for more than 2,000 farmers. So more than 2,000 farmers are not allowed to sell their produce until, all the results have been completed, etc. So the economic consequences are, of course, immense. I mean, they're so big, and we can't, at the moment, the authorities have said that they will pay the farmers for what they're missing out in income. But I mean, it's not only what the actual money that you make. I mean, what's going to happen with the cows if it turns out? Yeah. I mean, it's just only the milk that you can't sell. Many farmers are worried about whether the cows will have to, go to the slaughterhouse altogether, because, if you can't use them and if you can't work with them anymore, it might be the end of it. So, I mean, there are very, very serious consequences and a lot of worry among a lot of people in an area known for its agriculture.
Yeah, indeed. And not only the locals are concerned, but also I heard a story on the radio earlier this week that the firefighters, of course, they were protected, but then, of course, very quickly the police arrived, the riot police, CRS, to secure the area, and they had no protection whatsoever. So they went into this chemical plant with a lot of probably toxic fumes, and they had no protection whatsoever. So they are very worried about their health as well. It's quite astonishing that in 2019 something like this can happen, and then especially the way the government reacts.
And just to say that the whole problem with the smell and the sticky air is not over, and this is more than a week then after the disaster. People are still saying that they can be hard to breathe, and you can really feel the effect, and you still feel the fumes in the air.
Yeah,
one
absolutely.
week later.
So I think we'll talk about this again in the future if we know more about what happened in Rouen.
Vous écoutez So French.
You are listening to So French.
Well, now we mentioned it briefly when we were talking about Rouen and the fire. But the reason why a lot of this went unnoticed, or at least got very little media coverage, was because a former French president, former Paris mayor as well, Jacques Chirac, left this earth the same day as the Rouen fire, actually, last Thursday, and since then, Stefan, we have witnessed a rolling media coverage. That I have rarely seen before.
Absolutely. No, it was quite astonishing. It lasted for at least 5 days. So the day when he died, Chirac, was on a Thursday, until the day he was buried. So that was on a Monday. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. It was all the channels, 24 hours a day, they only spoke about Chirac, as if, some hero who single-handedly found a cure for cancer, found peace in the Middle East, and made everybody happy. Like Mère Thérèse died. It was I totally agree. In all these years that we've been living here, it was completely berserk. It was actually an orgy. And of course, the man, his death was not a surprise. I mean, the man was 80 years old.
Yeah, and he has been ill for a long time.
Absolutely.
He has been out of the public.
All the media had years to prepare his necrology, and yet